Chapter 1. The Arena Where Mercy Goes to Die. The palace of House Valor was built like a crown laid upside down on an ocean of clouds, its spires piercing the pale atmosphere of the Moonvale Surret. Its balconies hung with banners that shimmered in ultraviolet wavelengths only the noble bloodlines could see. Princess Saren stood behind a curtain of living crystal in the Imperial Viewing Gallery, looking down into the grand arena, as if she were peering into a throat. Thousands of nobles surrounded her in tears, their jeweled masks and perfumed robes forming a galaxy of wealth and cruelty, and beneath them, far below, the arena floor waited an oval of black sand imported from a dead world, chosen because it drank blood without staining. The chants rose like waves, not for honor, not for sport, but for the simple intoxication of watching someone else lose everything in public. Saren's fingers curled tight around the edge of the railing. Her family called it tradition. The Empire called it justice. But Saren had watched enough traditions to know the difference between ceremony and entertainment. This wasn't a duel. This was a feast, and the crowd was hungry. Down on the sand, the prisoners were herded into the light like animals. The announcer's voice amplified, musical, cruel listed their crimes with theatrical disdain: piracy, rebellion, insolence, refusing tribute. Saren knew some of it was true. She also knew most of it was convenient. The Empire used the arena like a language. It spoke fear into the bones of anyone who might one day consider disobedience. Today's spectacle had a special edge, though, a rumor thread that had traveled through noble gossip faster than any courier drone. A human is in the pit. Human. The word had felt like a myth when she was younger. A monster whispered about at diplomatic banquets. Deathworlders with iron bones and predator eyes. Creatures who evolved with storms and hunger and learned to smile while they killed. In the Empire's propaganda, humans were either useful savages or uncontrollable vermin. In the Empire's black market, humans were rare prizes, hired as security or assassins, dangerous tools wrapped in contracts and shock collars. Saren's father, High Regent Valor, sat on his throne of pale alloy and watched with pleased detachment. "You will learn," he had told her earlier, voice smooth as poison, "that peace is not a moral state. Peace is a posture of dominance, and dominance must be demonstrated." He had gestured toward the arena as if it were a lesson board. Saren had wanted to argue, but she'd learned that arguments were only tolerated when they were decorative. When she protested too strongly, her father's expression hardened with something like disappointment, and he reminded her, gently, that royal compassion was a weakness the Empire could not afford. So she stood now, silent, while the announcer introduced the next contestant, a human male, stripped of most gear, wrists bound, posture straight in a way that looked less like pride and more like calculation. He didn't look like the monsters in the pamphlets. He looked ordinary at first glance. Tall, yes. Broad-shouldered, yes. But he was lean rather than bulky, like a runner, like someone built for endurance rather than show. His hair was dark and cropped close. His face was bruised along one cheek, and his lip bore a split that had dried into a thin line. He wore prisoner cloth that didn't fit his frame, but he stood as if the cloth were armor. His eyes scanned the arena without panic, without pleading, pausing on the exits, the walls, the raised platforms where archers waited in case the entertainment got messy. Saren's stomach tightened. She had seen many prisoners in that pit. Most looked for mercy. This one looked for patterns. A metal gate on the far side of the arena thundered open, and the first opponent came out, one of the Empire's prized beasts, bred in vats and trained by starvation. It moved on 4 thick limbs, plated in chitin, its jaw split into 3 hinged segments that could crush bone. The crowd roared with delighted anticipation. Saren leaned forward despite herself. She hated that her heart sped up. She hated that a part of her wanted to know what would happen next. The human was unarmed, wasn't he? Or was that part of the show, watching the Deathworlder die? The beast charged. The human didn't run. He didn't scream. He didn't even raise his bound hands in a futile defense. He took 1 step sideways, just one, and the beast's momentum carried it past him by inches. The human pivoted on the ball of his foot, as if he'd rehearsed the move 1,000 times. When the beast skidded and tried to turn, its claws digging furrows into the black sand, the human moved again, calm and efficient, guiding the beast's trajectory the way a hunter guides prey toward a trap. Saren blinked, confused. He wasn't fighting the beast. He was steering it. On the second pass, the beast lunged with its jaws wide. The human dropped low, sliding beneath the snapping mouth like liquid. And for a moment Saren saw the cords of muscle along his back tighten with controlled strength. His bound wrist struck the beast's underside with a dull thump, not a punch meant to injure, but a tap, a cue. The beast spun, enraged, and smashed into a stone pillar that held up a decorative arch. The crowd laughed. Saren's father smiled. "See," he murmured, pleased. "Even the human performs." But Saren's eyes widened as she noticed what the human was actually doing. He was counting, not aloud, but in the small shifts of his gaze, the timing between the beast's turns, the way he measured the pillar's position relative to the gate, relative to the armed guards on the ledges. The beast was a distraction. The arena was a map. The human was learning it in real time. Then he did something that made Saren's breath catch. He deliberately allowed the beast to clip him just enough for the claws to tear cloth and skin along his arm. Blood spattered onto the black sand, and the crowd roared louder, intoxicated by the sight. Saren felt sick. Why would he let himself be hurt? Because the beast tasted blood. It became more reckless, faster, lunging with less caution. The human backed away at exactly the right pace, drawing it toward the pillar again. At the last second, he sidestepped. The beast slammed into the pillar with full force. The arch above cracked. Dust and fragments rained down. The crowd cheered, thinking it was accidental comedy. Saren stared, horrified, as the human watched the crack like a scientist. Then he moved, pulling the beast around for another charge, and another. Each time, the beast struck the weakened structure harder. The pillar gave way. With a thunderous groan, the decorative arch collapsed right onto the beast's back. Chitin shattered. The creature screamed, a sound like metal tearing, then went still under the rubble. For a heartbeat, the arena was stunned into silence. Then the nobles erupted in applause. Saren didn't clap. Her hands had gone cold. Her mind raced. The human had killed the beast using the arena itself, using architecture and momentum. That wasn't brawling. That wasn't gladiator theatrics. That was hunting. The announcer laughed into the mic, voice dripping with amusement. The human proves entertaining. Shall we increase the challenge? A second gate opened. Then a third. More beasts, different shapes. A pack this time. Saren's throat tightened. The Empire wanted to see him break. They thought they were escalating a fight. But Saren could see something else in the human's posture now. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't merely surviving. He was adjusting, refining. And the look in his eyes, sharp, focused, predatory, was the look of a creature that didn't belong in a cage. The pack spread out, trying to encircle him. The crowd leaned forward, eager for gore. Saren leaned forward too, but for a different reason. She had suddenly realized something that made her skin prickle with fear. The human wasn't learning how to beat the beasts. He was learning how to beat the arena. And once a hunter knows the terrain, the next thing he hunts is the one who thought they were in control. Chapter 2. The princess learns what a predator really is. The second wave began like a ritual performed by engineers rather than priests. The beasts emerged with choreographed menace, each one designed to trigger a different kind of panic. One moved low and fast, its limbs jointed backward like a nightmare. Another was tall, its spine crowned with sensory quills that shimmered as it tasted vibrations. A third dragged a heavy tail that ended in a hammer of bone. Their handlers had trained them to spread, to pressure, to force prey into exhaustion. Saren had seen them tear armored rebels apart, and then sniff the blood from the sand, as if savoring a meal. The nobles watching around her murmured excitedly, predicting how long the human would last. 10 seconds. 20. 1 minute if he was lucky. It was a math of cruelty. Saren wanted to scream at them that they were measuring the wrong thing, that they were treating a predator like prey, and that this mistake, this arrogant misunderstanding, was about to teach the Empire a lesson it couldn't afford. The human stood in the center, wrists still bound, chest rising and falling slow and steady. He lowered his stance, not like someone preparing to throw punches, but like someone preparing to sprint. When the pack surged, he didn't run away from them. He ran into the gap between them, slipping past the first snap of jaws so close Saren felt it in her own bones. The beasts snapped at empty air and collided with each other, snarling in confusion. The human used their momentum like a current. He guided them the way he'd guided the first beast, subtle footwork, tight pivots, small feints, turning their coordinated attack into chaos. The fast one lunged again. The human suddenly stopped, ducked, and the beast overshot, skidding into the path of the hammer-tail creature. The hammer came down with a brutal crack on its own packmate. The crowd howled with laughter. Saren's father leaned back, pleased, as if this were all harmless sport. Saren's nails dug crescents into her palm. The human's eyes flicked up briefly to the royal box. Saren flinched, certain he was glaring at her father, at the throne, at the empire itself. But his gaze didn't carry hatred. It carried assessment. Like a hunter glancing at a ridge line to mark where the wind comes from. Like a man cataloging threats with cold practicality. When his eyes passed over Saren's face, she felt a strange jolt, not attraction, not pity, but recognition of something more dangerous. He saw her as part of the environment, not a person. A feature of the landscape. That meant he wasn't bargaining with their morality. He wasn't trying to persuade anyone to stop. He was simply calculating how to survive long enough to escape, and, in doing so, he might break the rules that kept everyone else safe. One of the arena's overseers shouted something, and a panel on the floor opened, releasing a mist that glittered in the lights. Saren recognized it. A stimulant pheromone designed to make the beasts more aggressive. The nobles applauded the escalation. The beasts' pupils widened. Their muscles tightened. The pack's movements became frantic, less strategic, and more violently hungry. The human inhaled once, slow, as if tasting the chemical in the air. He didn't cough. He didn't stagger. Instead, his expression sharpened, and Saren realized with horror that the stimulant wasn't affecting him the way it affected them. Humans, she remembered, were Deathworlders not because they were born evil, but because they evolved under constant biological warfare. Their bodies were stubborn fortresses. Their nervous systems were calibrated to survive poisons that would kill others. The Empire's tricks, fear, spectacle, controlled escalation were based on assumptions about what bodies could tolerate. The human's body did not obey those assumptions. He moved toward the arena wall. The pack followed, thinking they were driving him into a corner. Saren's throat tightened as she saw the plan forming in his posture. He wanted them close. He wanted them concentrated. He wanted them. Saren's stomach dropped to be heavy and panicked enough to collide with something structural again. The wall he approached was not solid stone. It was a layered barrier with a thin seam near the basin access panel for maintenance drones. The human had noticed it earlier. He planted his foot near the seam, then pivoted sharply as the largest beast lunged. The beast slammed into the wall. The seam buckled. Metal groaned. The human shifted again, letting the second beast hit the same point. The wall's panel loosened. The third beast, snarling, hammered it with its tail. The panel burst open. Behind it, darkness, cables, a maintenance crawl space, the artery of the arena's internal infrastructure. The crowd roared, thinking it was another accident, another entertaining coincidence. Saren's father smiled again. Remarkable, he murmured. Even dying, humans are theatrical. Saren couldn't hold it anymore. She leaned toward him, voice trembling. Father, this is wrong. He didn't even look at her. It is necessary. Down in the pit, the human dove into the open crawl space, not to escape, Saren realized, but to change the fight's geometry. The beasts followed, half of them wedging into the narrow opening, snarling, trapping themselves. The human's bound wrists slipped against the metal edge in a quick, brutal motion. The binding material frayed. Again. He used the wall like a blade. With a final twist, the restraints snapped. For the first time, he had free hands. Saren's lungs locked. Free hands meant no longer performing. Free hands meant the thing her instincts had been trying to name since the first beast died. The human stepped back out of the crawl space with a length of cable in his hands. Not a weapon designed for killing, but a tool. He looped it around the neck of the quill-backed beast as it lunged, then yanked sideways, using his full body weight. The beast's quills flared, but the cable tightened, cutting off its breath. It thrashed, smashing into its packmates, turning the cramped opening into a tangle of bodies. The human kept the cable taut, face expressionless. It wasn't rage. It wasn't showmanship. It was efficient, clinical. Saren's voice rose without permission, sharp and panicked. Stop, she shouted, startling nobles around her. Several turned, shocked that a princess would cry out during the entertainment. But Saren wasn't speaking to the beasts. She wasn't speaking to the crowd. She was speaking to the overseers and guards, to anyone who still believed this was a fight. Stop, she screamed again, pointing down at the pit. Human isn't fighting, he's hunting. The words echoed through the gallery. Some nobles laughed. Others frowned. The announcer faltered for the first time, voice slipping as if uncertain how to frame this new tone. Saren's father finally turned his gaze on her, and in it she saw not anger, but something colder. Disappointment that she had spoken truth in public. Below, the human released the cable and grabbed a fallen shard of the collapsed wall panel, a jagged piece of metal. He tested its weight in his palm, like a butcher judging a knife. Then he stepped toward the trapped beasts, and Saren saw the terrible shift. He had moved beyond survival into control. He would not simply kill them. He would dismantle them in a way that sent a message to the arena itself. He was teaching the Empire what happens when you throw a predator into a cage and expect it to behave like prey. The first beast lunged. The human sidestepped, drove the metal shard into the joint behind its jaw, and twisted. The beast collapsed with a wet sound. The second beast tried to flee. The human grabbed its tail, yanked it back into the pile, and slammed its head into the wall hard enough to crack bone. The crowd went silent, not in horror exactly, but in confusion, because the violence had become too real. It wasn't stylized. It wasn't choreographed. It was the ugly, efficient reality of a hunter ending a hunt. Saren's father rose from his throne. "Guards," he said quietly. The royal guards along the ledges tensed, rifles tracking the human. But even as they aimed, Saren saw the human glance up again, eyes scanning the ledges with calm calculation. He had expected this. He had planned for it. That was the terrifying part. He wasn't improvising anymore. He was executing. And Saren realized, with a sick certainty, that the Empire had already lost control of the narrative. The arena was no longer a stage where power flowed downward from throne to pit. It had become a hunting ground, and the hunter had finally lifted his gaze toward the ones who cheered. Chapter 3. The moment the crown becomes prey. The first shot didn't come from anger. It came from protocol. A guard on the eastern ledge fired a stun bolt toward the human's torso, aiming to drop him quickly before the crowd panicked, before the nobles stampeded, before the emperor's household lost face. The bolt streaked through the air like a blue comet, and Saren's body tensed, expecting the human to collapse. Instead, he shifted just a half step, a turn of shoulder letting the bolt graze his arm and slam into the sand behind him. He didn't even flinch. He looked toward the shooter, not with fury, but with the same predatory focus he'd used on the beasts. In that glance, Saren saw the terrifying logic of the human mind. You fired. You are now part of the hunt. The crowd's mood fractured. Some nobles shouted for more, thinking this escalation was part of the show. Others began to sense something wrong, a break in the safe illusion that kept cruelty palatable. A few stood up, uncomfortable, because they recognized real danger the way prey recognizes a shadow moving the wrong way. Saren remained frozen at the railing, her throat raw from screaming, her mind racing with a question she couldn't stop. If he gets out, what will he do? She didn't mean to herself. She meant to the Empire, to her father, to the system that had forced him into this pit and expected him to die politely. Down in the arena, the human moved toward the maintenance crawlspace again, but not to hide. He dove inside, disappearing into darkness. The guard shouted. The announcer's voice rose in frantic confusion, trying to frame this as entertainment. The human seeks refuge in the underworks. How thrilling dash, but the words rang hollow. A moment later, the arena lights flickered. The massive hollow screens around the stadium glitch-stuttered, showing static and distorted images. The crowd murmured uneasily. That wasn't supposed to happen. The arena was the Empire's jewel, built with redundant systems and fail-safes. It was designed to display dominance even in its architecture. A flickering light was embarrassing. Saren's father's jaw clenched. "Seal the exits," he ordered. "Lock down the galleries. I want him contained." Contained. The word was a prayer, a hope dressed as command. Inside the crawl space, the human was moving through the arena's guts past cables, coolant lines, emergency vents. Saren couldn't see him, but she could imagine it with unsettling clarity, because she had studied military history and knew what humans did best. They adapted. They turned environments into weapons. They treated infrastructure like anatomy, and they knew where to cut. The flickering lights weren't panic. They were deliberate. He was learning which systems controlled what, mapping the nervous system of the arena the way he'd mapped the beast's movements. A panel on the far side of the arena blew out with a bang, and smoke hissed upward. The crowd screamed. Guards shouted into comms. The human emerged not from the crawlspace near where he entered, but from a completely different point, near the base of the western ledge. He had traveled through the underworks and climbed out beneath the guards' positions. He stood there now with a strip of cable wrapped around one hand, his other hand holding a small device he'd scavenged from somewhere in arena maintenance remote, perhaps. The look on his face was calm. Too calm. Saren's blood ran cold. He raised the device and pressed something. A section of the western ledge's railing suddenly released, dropping 2 guards into the arena. They fell hard, armor clanging, stunned by the shock of impact. The crowd shrieked. The guards on the other ledges aimed downward, but their line of fire was cluttered now by their own comrades on the sand. The human didn't rush the fallen guards immediately. He backed away, drawing them, keeping distance, forcing the ledge guards to hesitate. He was manipulating them the same way he manipulated beasts, using their protective instincts, their training, their protocols against them. Saren's voice came out as a whisper now. He's controlling the battlefield. Her father ignored her, eyes narrowed. He cannot leave the arena. But the arena wasn't the boundary anymore. It was simply the first layer. The human turned and sprinted toward the central pillar's supports, the same architectural bones he'd already tested. He climbed a slanted piece of rubble with athletic ease, then leaped onto a support beam. The nobles gasped, some thrilled, some terrified. He was high now, close enough that Saren could see the intensity in his eyes, the sweat and grime on his face, the blood smeared along his forearm. He paused, balancing, scanning. In that moment, Saren realized something else. He wasn't looking for the easiest exit. He was looking for the most impactful one. A stun bolt fired again. He ducked. Another guard fell when a panel beneath their feet shifted another sabotage. The human's movements were not random. They were steps in a hunt. He was thinning the herd. He was forcing mistakes. He was pushing the Empire's enforcers into positions where they had to choose between killing him and protecting nobles between violence and optics. Then he did the unthinkable. He ran up the support beam and jumped straight toward the royal viewing gallery. For a heartbeat, time slowed. Saren's lungs forgot how to breathe. The crowd screamed in a wave as the human flew through the air, a dark silhouette against palace lights. Guards raised rifles, but they hesitated shooting toward the royal box, risked hitting nobles. The human landed on the edge of a lower balcony, rolled, and sprang upward again, using decorative architecture like footholds. He climbed like he belonged to gravity differently, like the palace itself was a hunting tree. Saren's father stood, fury tightening his face. Shoot him, he snapped. Royal guards more disciplined, more loyal fired anyway, bolts streaking past the human. One hit his shoulder. He stumbled, but didn't fall. He grabbed a hanging banner rope, swung, and kicked off a wall, landing on the gallery level. Now he was among the nobles. The crowd's terror became physical. Aristocrats stumbled backward, tripping over robes, masks clattering to the floor. Perfume and fear mixed into a sickly smell. Saren's heart pounded so hard she thought it would break her ribs. The human stood in the center of the gallery like a storm given human shape. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He simply turned his head slowly, eyes scanning faces. Predatory calm. A hunter deciding which movement mattered. Royal guards surrounded him, rifles trained. On your knees, one barked. The human looked at the guard's weapon, then at the guard's eyes, then at the corridor behind the guard and exit route. He smiled slightly. Not joy, not cruelty. Calculation. He moved. It happened so fast Saren barely followed. He grabbed a nearby noble, an overweight duke who had been too slow to flee, pulled him into the line of fire, and used the duke's body as a shield. The guards froze, horrified at the optics. The duke squealed in terror, pleading. The human didn't hurt him. He simply used him like cover, shifting sideways, stepping toward a security panel on the wall. His free hand slammed onto the panel, fingers moving with swift familiarity. The door behind the guards clicked open. He knows their systems, Saren thought wildly. He's been studying everything. He shoved the duke aside, not violently, but firmly, and slipped through the open door into the inner corridors of the palace. The guards surged after him, but the corridor lights flickered again. Doors sealed. A section of floor dropped into a service shaft, swallowing 2 guards with screams. The human had turned the palace into an extension of the arena. The hunt had moved indoors. Saren's father's face twisted with rage and humiliation. He turned to his commander. Get him, he hissed. Bring me his head. Saren couldn't stop herself. Father, she said, voice shaking. If you chase him like prey, he will keep hunting. Her father's eyes snapped to hers. Then what do you suggest? He demanded. And for the first time Saren heard fear under his anger, because he understood, finally, that this wasn't about a gladiator escaping. This was about the Empire's illusion cracking in front of everyone. Saren swallowed. She thought of the human's eyes scanning the gallery, his refusal to plead, his refusal to be entertained. Talk, she said. Before he decides the only language you understand is blood. The commander laughed bitterly. Talk to a Deathworlder? Princess, he's a savage. Saren's gaze hardened. No, she whispered. He's not savage. He's methodical, and that is far worse. In the corridors beyond, alarms began to wail. Somewhere, Deeper in the palace, something exploded, perhaps a power junction, perhaps a security lock. The nobles screamed in panic and began rushing for exits. The palace built as a symbol of control had become chaotic. And Saren, standing amid the collapse of order, realized the true nightmare. The human wasn't hunting to escape anymore. He was hunting to teach. And the lesson was aimed at the crown itself. Chapter 4. The princess steps between the crown and the hunter. Saren ran. She had never run in the palace corridors without escort before. Royalty did not hurry. Royalty glided. Royalty was supposed to be the still center of the storm. But now the storm had teeth, and the still center was about to be torn open. She pushed through panicked servants and fleeing nobles, ignoring shouted commands, ignoring the guards who tried to block her path. Her dress snagged on a railing and ripped, the jeweled fabric tearing like paper. She didn't care. Every instinct screamed at her that if she didn't reach him first, the Empire would respond the only way it knew. Escalation, violence, humiliation turned into slaughter. And the human predator that he was would respond in kind. This would become more than an escape. It would become a massacre, and her father would call it necessary. The palace alarms wailed like wounded animals. Lights strobed, doors sealed, then reopened. The human had infiltrated the security grid in ways Saren couldn't fully comprehend, turning the palace's own defenses into moving walls that separated pursuit teams, funneling them into dead ends, forcing them to break formation. She saw evidence of it everywhere. Guards clustered at locked doors, pounding in frustration. Drones hovering uselessly with their targeting systems flickering. Security panels sparking as if overwritten. This wasn't brute force. This was sabotage with intelligence, designed not just to survive, but to control the chase. He's hunting them, Saren thought, heart pounding. He's making them run his maze. She followed the pattern as best she could, using her knowledge of palace layout, slipping through servant passages and hidden stairwells. She could hear distant shouts, the crackle of stunned fire, the occasional thud of bodies hitting walls. Once, she passed a corridor where two guards lay unconscious, neatly bound with their own restraint cords. Their weapons were placed on the floor beside them, unloaded. It wasn't mercy. It was efficiency. The human didn't kill when he didn't need to, but he didn't hesitate when he did. That was what terrified Saren most. He was not driven by bloodlust. He was driven by purpose. At last, she reached the old wing, a section of the palace built before modern expansions, full of stone arches and narrow windows overlooking the cloud sea. Few nobles visited it. It smelled faintly of dust and old incense. Saren's grandmother used to come here to pray in secret. Saren had come here once to cry when she was younger, when she realized compassion was considered a political flaw. Now she heard footsteps ahead, soft, controlled. Someone moving without panic. She stepped into the corridor and saw him. The human stood near a window, back half-turned, one hand resting on the stone ledge as if steadying himself. His shoulder was bleeding from the stun bolt hit, the fabric around it charred. His forearm was streaked with dried blood from the arena. His breathing was calm, but his eyes were alive with that sharp predator focus. He was listening, sensing pursuit before it arrived. In his other hand, he held a small data slate, palace schematics, perhaps stolen from a guard. Saren stopped a few meters away, heart hammering. She lifted her hand slowly, showing she carried no weapon. Her voice came out hoarse. Human. His head turned instantly, eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, Saren felt like prey under a spotlight. She forced herself not to flinch. The human's gaze swept her posture, her hands, the corridor behind her, the possible angles of attack. Then, with subtle surprise, it lingered on her face. You're the one who yelled, he said, his voice low, accented, but clearly translated by palace systems. In the arena. Saren swallowed. Yes. He studied her, and she realized that his predatory calm wasn't hatred. It was vigilance. Constant, exhausting vigilance. A hunter's focus born not from joy, but from necessity. Why are you here, he asked. To stall me? To talk me down while your guards circle? Saren shook her head, slowly. To stop them from getting you killed, she said, then corrected herself because she knew it sounded ridiculous. And to stop you from killing them. The human's mouth twitched slightly, a half-smile that carried no warmth. That's ambitious. Saren took a careful step forward, then stopped again, respecting distance. They think you're fighting, she said. They think you're a gladiator trying to escape. They don't understand, Dash. I'm hunting, he finished, eyes sharpening. Yeah, you figured that out faster than your father. At the mention of her father, Saren's throat tightened. He is afraid, she admitted quietly. But he hides it under cruelty, because that is what our empire rewards. The human's gaze didn't soften. Fear doesn't excuse cages. No, Saren said, forcing the word out like a blade. It doesn't. Silence hung between them. The alarm seemed distant here, muffled by stone. Saren could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the humans breathing. Then she heard something else, boots, approaching, disciplined, closer than before. A pursuit team closing in. The human's eyes flicked toward the corridor junction. They're coming, he said. Saren nodded. I know. She drew a breath. Listen to me. If you keep hunting them through the palace, they will escalate. They will stop using stun bolts. They will use lethal rounds. And if you kill enough of them, they will call you a terrorist. They will use your blood as propaganda to justify more cages. They will say, see, humans are monsters. And the nobles will believe them because it protects their comfort. The human stared at her, expression unreadable. And what do you want? He asked. You want me to surrender? Back to the pit. Back to collars and contracts. Saren's hands trembled, but she kept them raised. No, she said firmly. I want you to leave. Alive. Free. But not as a monster they can parade. A harsh laugh escaped him. Princess, you live in a palace that runs on monster-making. Saren flinched because it was true, but she steadied herself. Then let me break something, she whispered. Let me break it from the inside. The boots grew louder. The human's posture shifted subtly, ready to move. Saren realized he was seconds away from vanishing again, slipping into another corridor, another trap. The hunt would continue. She had to gamble now. She stepped closer, still not within striking distance, but close enough that her voice could be quiet. There is a way out, she said. A real way. Not through guards. Not through killing. The old docking bay beneath the eastern spire, my grandmother used it to smuggle refugees once. It's sealed in records, but I know the access code. There is a service ship there for emergencies. No tracking beacon. Old, but functional. The human's eyes narrowed. Why would you help me? Saren forced herself to meet his gaze. Because I screamed to stop them, she said. And because when I saw you hunt, I realized something. The Empire is terrified of you, but it also needs you to be a monster. If you leave without becoming what they want, you steal their story. The human's jaw tightened, the muscles in his cheek flexing. And what do you get out of it? He asked, because hunters always ask what the bait costs. Saren's voice shook. A chance to sleep without hearing screams from the arena, she said. A chance to prove that mercy isn't weakness. A chance to choose something different than the cruelty I was born into. For a heartbeat, the human looked almost tired, like a man carrying too many graves. Then his gaze sharpened again as the pursuit team rounded the far corridor. Saren heard the click of weapons being raised, the harsh bark of an order. Stand down, a commander shouted. Princess, move away. Saren didn't move. The human's eyes flicked to her father's guards, then back to Saren. She could see the calculation in him. Kill them all and escape, or trust the princess of an empire that had tried to feed him to beasts. Saren made the decision for him. She stepped in front of the human, placing her body between the rifles and the predator. Her voice rose, ringing through the corridor with royal authority she had never used like this before. Stop, she commanded, and the guards hesitated because royalty was still royalty, even in chaos. Lower your weapons. That is an order. Princess Dash, the commander began, panicked. Saren's eyes burned. If you fire, you will strike me first, she said, daring them. And if you kill me, the nobles will not call this a tragedy. They will call it an inconvenience. But the people will hear. The servants will whisper. And House Valor will bleed legitimacy. Her father's guards froze, trapped by politics, by optics. Saren felt a bitter satisfaction. For once, the Empire's obsession with image could be used against it. Behind her, the human moved. She felt him shift close enough that she could smell smoke and sweat and iron on him. He did not grab her. He did not use her as a shield like he had used the Duke. That mattered. Instead, he leaned close and whispered, If this is a trap, princess, I'll hunt everyone who said it. Saren's voice barely moved. Then don't let it be a trap, she whispered back. Let it be a door. The guards shouted again, confused, unwilling to fire. Saren turned and walked slowly, deliberately down the corridor away from them, toward the eastern stairwell. She did not look back. The human followed in her wake, silent as a shadow. The guards hesitated, then trailed at a distance, too afraid of political consequences to shoot, too afraid of the human to rush him. They descended through hidden passages Saren hadn't used in years. Old stone steps, rusted doors, air that smelled of engine oil and forgotten secrets. At last they reached the sealed docking bay. Saren pressed her palm to a panel and spoke a code her grandmother had taught her like a bedtime story. The panel blinked. The door unlocked with a deep, reluctant groan, as if the palace itself resented being opened. Inside sat a small service ship, dusty, angular, ugly in a way that promised practicality. Saren's heart raced. She turned to the human. "This is your exit," she said. "Now go." He stared at the ship, then at her, and Saren saw something shift in his eyes, something human, beneath the hunter. "You're not coming?" he asked, voice quiet. Saren swallowed hard. "If I leave," she said, "they will replace me with someone colder. If I stay, maybe I can break the arena. Maybe I can end it." The human's gaze held hers for a long moment, as if weighing whether her words were naive or brave. Then he nodded once. "Princess," he said, and the words sounded strange in his mouth, not reverent, not mocking, simply factual. "You screamed in a room full of monsters. That takes more courage than killing." Saren's throat tightened. "Go," she repeated, because if she spoke longer she might lose resolve. He stepped up the ramp into the ship. As the hatch began to close, Saren felt panic flare. What if guards regained their courage? What if her father arrived? What if this ended in blood anyway? The human paused at the doorway, looking back at her one last time. "They will tell stories about me," he said. "They'll say I was a beast." Saren lifted her chin, tears burning her eyes. "Then I will tell a different story," she said. "I will tell them you were a hunter who refused to be a toy." The hatch sealed. Engines whined. The ship lifted, dust swirling, and then it shot out of the docking bay into open sky, vanishing into the cloud sea beyond the palace spires. The guards stood stunned, weapons lowered, unsure what to do now that the prey had escaped without a massacre. Saren stood alone in the docking bay's shadow and felt the weight of what she had done settle onto her shoulders like armor she had finally chosen. Somewhere above, the arena still existed. The nobles still cheered. Her father still sat on a throne that believed cruelty was strength. But Saren had seen a human hunt, and in that terrifying clarity, she had found her own spine. She turned back toward the palace, toward the alarms, toward the political storm waiting to swallow her whole. Her voice was quiet but steady, spoken to no one and everyone at once. "Stop," she whispered again, not as a plea this time, but as a promise. "This is where the hunt ends." And somewhere out in the stars, a human predator carried a story the Empire couldn't control, a story that began with an arena, a scream, and a princess who finally learned that the most dangerous kind of power isn't violence. It's refusing to play the role you were assigned.